Welcome to another episode of our general election special. In this video, we'll be looking at what the major topics of debate are in the election and who's campaigning for what. Before that, let's do a really quick recap of the basic facts about the election. The election takes place on October 31st. It is for the House of Representatives, which is Japan's lower chamber of parliament. The right-of-center ruling coalition of the Liberal Democratic Party and Komeito is looking to maintain a strong majority, while the left-of-center opposition, centered around the Constitutional Democratic Party of Japan, hopes to present an alternative. For more details on the basics, check out my previous video. Now let's move on to the topics. According to a public opinion poll by NHK last weekend, the economy and fiscal policies was the most important issue for a plurality of voters. It beat out measures against COVID-19, which suggests that people have turned their attention to the post-COVID world. This is because Japan has seen a huge drop in COVID cases recently. Daily cases in Tokyo fell below 50, a great improvement from more than 5,000 just 2 months ago. Progress in COVID vaccinations across the country is seen to be a factor behind the decline. But that doesn't mean the effects of the COVID pandemic have eased. The pandemic and the state of emergency in Japan have caused many service sector businesses such as restaurants and hotels to suffer financially. The side effects of the pandemic, such as a slowdown in the manufacturing industry as a result of decreased consumption, have also dealt a blow to businesses and workers. Non-regular workers, such as part-time workers, have also been especially vulnerable. As a result, all political parties have placed great emphasis on kick-starting the economy to jump out of the COVID slump and helping those in need. But many of them disagree on how Japan should go about achieving them. Specifically, the relationship between growth and redistribution is in the spotlight. The ruling Liberal Democratic Party generally takes the position that economic growth is necessary to lift everybody in society up. It calls for investments in things like disaster management and semiconductor technologies. It is also promising tax cuts to companies which raise their employees' wages. Meanwhile, the opposition takes the stance that redistribution must come before growth, citing the failures of Abenomics, the neoliberal economic policy of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. To this end, many opposition parties are calling for cash handouts, whether it be for all citizens or for struggling households. But the biggest clash between the two sides on the issue of the economy is what to do with consumption tax. Opposition parties hope that lowering the 10% consumption tax to 5% or less, either temporarily or permanently, will help struggling families' finances while boosting consumption and energizing the economy at the same time. The LDP has criticized the plan as being reckless, arguing that promising to lower the consumption tax in the future will only lead to people refraining from buying goods and services until then. The ruling bloc also said that tax cuts would be bad for government finances, to which the opposition said that the government can issue government bonds. According to an Asahi Shimbun opinion poll, 57% of respondents said that the consumption tax should be capped as is, against 35% arguing for a temporary reduction. Many citizens are skeptical of whether the opposition's proposal is feasible, but at the same time, many question if the LDP even has a viable growth strategy for all their talk about the need for growth. Although many may not think it to be the most important topic, the government's measures against COVID-19 is also an important issue in the election. This topic can be generally split into two parts: the assessment of the government's COVID measures thus far and the plans for future measures. The election is seen by some as an opportunity to pass judgment on COVID measures under former Prime Ministers Yoshihide Suga and Shinzo Abe before him, as it is the first nationwide election since the start of the pandemic. The public is generally dissatisfied with the COVID measures, as can be seen in the high disapproval ratings for Suga before his resignation last month. People are especially unhappy that the government was only taking measures reactively, such as imposing states of emergencies only after infections have exploded, and trying to increase hospital beds only after they've started running out. Some are also frustrated that the government held the Tokyo Olympics, which was feared to potentially become a super-spreader event, and that it launched the Go To Travel and Go To Eat campaigns, aimed at getting people to go to restaurants and trips, despite infection cases remaining high. But it's a bit difficult to frame the election as being purely an assessment of the past COVID policies, as the government changed hands to Fumio Kishida earlier this month. Instead of looking at the past, some voters would rather look to the future, namely what COVID policies Kishida or the opposition plan to take. One proposal being discussed is drawing up legislation to enable the central or local governments to impose lockdowns. Unlike some countries such as the UK and Australia, Japan does not have the legal framework that allows lockdowns, so it has only been able to make strongly worded requests at best. This has allowed some citizens and businesses to go against the requests without the fear of punishment. The ruling LDP is leaning towards enabling lockdowns, as is the regional party Osaka Ishin no Kai. The unified opposition is more or less opposed to restricting people's civil liberties in the name of lockdowns, saying that there is more the government can do and should do before it considers such a drastic measure. As is usually the case in Japanese nationwide elections, the issue of national security is also a significant topic. In addition to the usual debate on whether to revise the pacifist clause of the Constitution, which the ruling bloc is in favor of and the opposition against, there is also new talk on possessing the ability to attack enemy bases. Defense hawks, especially in the ruling LDP, say that Japan must be able to attack enemy bases in order to prevent missile attacks. They argue that attacks to disrupt missile preparations in countries like North Korea are constitutional, as it is necessary for self-defense. Meanwhile, many in the opposition say that it is difficult to identify whether missiles being prepared are intended to strike Japan, or even whether missiles are being readied for attack to begin with, meaning that Japan may attack another country that had no intention of starting a fight, dragging the world into war. They also say that such preemptive attacks are first strikes, which is banned under the Constitution. Although only 6% of people in the NHK poll put security as the most important topic in the election, the recent heightening of tensions in the Taiwan Strait and Northeast Asia at large has made the topic all the more important. Also contributing to the issue's significance in the election is the fact that LDP's chief of policy is Sanae Takaichi, a staunch conservative and defense hawk, meaning that the ruling party is likely to push for measures like allowing base attacks. A debate of party leaders held Monday at the Japan National Press Club included a scene in which debaters were asked to raise their hands if they supported a plan to allow married couples to have different last names. All of the leaders raised their hands except for one, Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. The scene exemplified the state of discussions in Japanese politics regarding the dual surname plan, as well as discussions on many issues related to gender and LGBTQ rights. The plan to allow spouses to have different last names is hoped to benefit women, who almost always change their last names when they get married. While women can use informal last names in the workplace and other settings, the fact that they must change their legal last names results in many issues. The LDP is against the policy as it goes against the traditional family ideals of a united, harmonious family under a patriarch. Some conservatives argue that letting families have different last names lead to unhappy marriages and unhappy children, the evidence for which is anecdotal at best and virtually non-existent in countries that already allow it. Issues related to LGBTQ rights, such as the creation of anti-discrimination laws against sexual minorities and the legalization of same-sex marriage, is also supported by the opposition bloc but opposed by the ruling bloc, more or less for the same reasons. Lastly, let's briefly talk about nuclear power. Ever since the nuclear meltdown at Fukushima Daiichi power plant following the March 11th earthquake and tsunami in 2011, many in the opposition bloc have been campaigning for phasing out nuclear power due to its immense risks. Until recently, the ruling bloc has mainly refuted against such movements by saying that nuclear power is necessary to meet the country's electricity demand. But it has recently begun arguing that nuclear power is necessary to meet the government's target of reducing carbon emissions to net zero by 2050. The goal which was set by former Prime Minister Suga last year. They say that, without nuclear power, Japan will have to continue relying on fossil fuels. So that's it for my brief analysis on topics being debated in the election, and who's on which side. Please subscribe and hit the notification icon for more updates about the general election.